So I'm finally back with some more science fiction fantasy reviews. I have some great books to talk about, some new releases, some backlist favorites, and I gotta be honest, included in this list is a couple books that a friend sent me, and you all send me really weird books to read, so I'm gonna talk about those too. Let's get started. First, let's talk science fiction, starting with the Jinn-Bot of Shantiport by Samit Basu. This is an author who I read last year. I read their novella, The City Inside, and absolutely loved it, and so I was very anxious to read a full-length novel by them, and thankfully this one did not disappoint. This one is set in a place called Shantiport, which is a place to go to get onto a spaceship and go into space and the stars. However, the people that actually reside and live in Shantiport are quite impoverished and aren't necessarily the individuals that will get to go and escape their surroundings. And so we follow a family. Specifically, there is a daughter and her brother that we follow. The daughter himself is a bot, or specifically a monkey bot, and together you follow them as they are trying to get more for themselves. This is one that, I'll be honest, the world building, the setup is cuckoo banana pants, really bizarre, and yet I loved it so much. It definitely gave me very mild vibes towards something like Yoon-Hae Lee's books or something comparable to Ada Hoffman's books. And so I just love really twisty, weird science fiction. While it's definitely science fiction, it kind of leans into some almost fantastical elements in a way that's very unexpected. It's just very rich. It's very much its own world. I often complain that I don't love a lot of science fiction that is written in a way where the world building feels very hollow, or perhaps made of cardboard where you could just push it down and virtually be in our current present day. Instead, this feels completely unique and different, but definitely drawing from a lot of concepts, considerations, again, talking about class and privilege and who gets to go to the stars, which is a theme I've come to really love in science fiction, because it really does address the fact that space travel, for the most part, at least in our present day and any prospective future that we can see in the near term, is going to be a privilege of the rich. And so we get to see that conversation happening, but also you get a lot of interesting conversations around artificial intelligence, which in many books, again, can be very surface level, but instead this isn't just a straight, oh, is this a person or is it not, but really looking at more of the nuances of the way that we might interact differently with someone who is an artificial construct, and just some of the ideas that I hadn't actually considered before. So if you can tell, I really enjoyed this book. I've had a mediocre year when it comes to new release science fiction, and this is just the kind of book that just hits right in the sweet spot, reminds me why I love the genre so much, and makes me excited to read more of the new stuff coming out, because I love new creative ideas, and this author is definitely on his way to becoming a favorite if he keeps writing books like this. Now let's switch over to some backlist science fiction, starting with 2140 New York by Kim Stanley Robinson. And this is a standalone book that is set, as you can imagine, in 2140, and it's set in, as you can probably guess, New York. It is set in a future where New York has flooded, and so everyone has had to move up top to the top of the buildings, which essentially serve as islands. The story is told in a multiple number of perspectives, where we get individuals that are trying to live in this new world. This book definitely, in terms of the setup, feels a bit post-apocalyptic, or at least apocalyptic, as the world is flooding and things have just gone from bad to worse. The story starts out with two characters discussing economics and capitalism and how it has brought us to this situation. A lot of good criticism surrounding perhaps environmentalism, things like that. So this book definitely has opinions that it is placing on the readers. It definitely is the author putting in a bit of their perhaps authorial voice, some of the conversations that are in there. It can feel a little bit info dumpy at times. However, you're talking to someone who loves info dumps and happen to agree with a lot of the conversations the author was having through their characters. So it's a book that will either hit the right spot for some readers like myself, or might be a total miss for others, but I personally enjoyed it a lot. I think if you read the first chapter, you'll basically know if the book's for you, because I read the first chapter and thought, oh man, this book is going to be a favorite. I like the characters. As I mentioned, you kind of swap between perspectives, and while you come back to them, I found myself pleasantly equally attached to everyone. It's not always the case, where usually I want to just stick with a few characters. And as someone who's never been to New York City, obviously I've never lived there, I like the fact that the story is centered around the city and is very much a focal point of it all. There's a lot of descriptions and tie-ins, which probably will mean more to New Yorkers reading the book, but even as someone, a Canadian like myself, reading it from the outside, I still found it to be fascinating, even though I hadn't lived in that spot. And I think that's a really good thing to do, or a challenging thing to do properly, where you have a book that is so tied to a specific place but still works for readers like myself that don't necessarily get all of the insider nods and winks that the author is making along the way. So I really love this one. It definitely reminded me a lot of Neil Stephenson's work. and I think that they just have some interesting things to do. And this book was a complete surprise because if you follow my channel, you might know that I read Red Mars earlier this year and was kind of let down by it, which I know is a hugely unpopular opinion. Please don't yell at me in the comments. But I just didn't love the relationships and the characters in that one in the way that I wanted to. It kind of got in the way of the science fiction elements that I enjoy. And with this one, it just hit all the right sweet spots. I had such a good time with it. And it's definitely making me think I need to read more Kim Stanley Robinson because I was impressed. Next, let's talk about Semiosis by Sue Burke. And this is a science fiction story told over generations. We follow a group of colonists that have come from Earth to this planet. And when they arrive there and start to grow their own colony, they discover that possibly there is already sentient life there. Now, it's part of the synopsis, is not really a surprise. Basically, they discover sentient plants, and we watch them, as I mentioned, over the generations. So there are time skips throughout the story as they're trying to come to terms and cohabitate with these plants. Now, this is one I really enjoyed. For me, it was what I was looking for with something like Annihilation, which arguably was just meant to be a little bit more weird. And this one is perhaps more focused on the what if of taking a really bizarre, weird scenario and playing it out with a lot of scientific theories and ideas, playing around with different ways that this all could go about. At this time, I have read several different science fiction stories that are centered around a generational time jump, which I'm glad because I do find that these books are less jarring than they used to be. I used to really struggle when you jump ahead in time and kind of meet with different characters, but now I appreciate what it's doing. It wasn't a 5-star read, but really enjoyable, really unique, which is things that I love in my books. This was sent to me by my friend Whitney from Secret with Storycraft. I always say her channel name wrong. The Secret Sauce of Storycraft. There we go. Finally got it right, Whitney. And she sent me this book along with a few others that I'm going to talk about here. And I just love the fact that she knew that sentient plants was a pretty weird concept for a book that would be right up my alley. So given the books that she sent me, I don't know what it says about what she thinks of me as a reader, but we'll discuss in the comments down below. And then for Whitney, this is where the books get really weird, is she also sent me a copy of The Mount, which is a little science fiction story I'd never heard about before. It is set in a future where aliens have invaded Earth, they have taken over and completely taken control of the world. And so we follow the story from a young person who works as a racehorse, essentially. They are a human racehorse, so they are trained for these riding events. However, they are not running as we would think it, but actually with a person, or specifically an alien, riding on them. In the story, they are then rescued by these humans that are trying to save them. But the story is so much more complicated. This story, I'll be honest, is just bizarre, and I definitely thought it was funny that Whitney specifically picked out this book thinking that I would love it, because I think it says again something about my bizarre reading taste that she would think of such a messed up, weird book and think, I think Rachel should read this. And I take that as a huge compliment. I actually think that's fantastic. And that's exactly what this book is. It's really unique. Again, it wasn't a 5-star read for me. I definitely don't think it's perfect, but was it something I've never read before? Was it totally off the beaten path? Absolutely. You have a protagonist who perhaps is a bit naive and young given where they are in life. They don't fully understand the world that they have been brought up into. And so we see that, and this book just kind of goes in a few places that I didn't quite expect, which I like. And it's just, again, really uneasy. It's very short, easy to fly through. And again, perhaps a little bit simple. It feels a bit juvenile in places just because of the protagonist's mental capacity. But is it a memorable one that's going to stick with me for a really long time? Definitely. I recommend this book to those of you, again, that maybe aren't looking for a new all-time favorite book, but are just looking for something different, something a little bit messed up. This is the one I'd recommend. And continuing on with weird books that my friend Whitney sent me, I also want to talk about When Women Were Dragons. This is a fantasy story that was published, I believe, last year that I know a lot of people loved, but kind of flew under my radar. I'd heard the title, it sounded cool, but just for whatever reason, I never really looked it up. And so Whitney sent this book to me. And again, I can definitely see why, knowing how well she understands my weird tastes in books. So this is a story that is set in the past. In 1955, there was this event called, I think, like the mass dragoning. And in this time period, a bunch of women started sprouting wings and turning into dragons. And then you see the world evolve from there. And it's just a really bizarre what if scenario, really interesting piece of speculative fiction. As Whitney knows, and many of you do, I really love feminist fiction, ideas that explore different opportunities and challenges that women come across throughout the years. And this book is definitely it. It's just a bizarre reimagining of history and how the world would have changed if women had turned into dragons. It was something that I liked a lot in terms of concept. I didn't entirely enjoy my reading experience as much as I'd like to, and that is simply based off of just how I appreciate or like certain types of writing style, different narrative styles, and that's something that is so subjective to the reader that it is no fault to Whitney that I didn't completely love it. But in terms of concept, it's amazing. I thought it was doing some really smart things, having some really great conversations, and it's weird, but it's also not. When you read the story, it reads so common in terms of just stating the facts that you almost forget that it's a really bizarre, crazy concept. And if you just go along for the ride, it's really enjoyable. I had so much fun with it and I recommend it. I thought it was great, but it's not going to be for everyone. It's a weird one. It's a weird one, but you might want to read it because it's, again, pretty memorable. Next, we have A Stranger in the Citadel by Tobias S. Buckell. And this is a short novella that was sent to me for review. It's a fantasy story set in a world where the idea is that librarians are not meant to live. That is a whole synopsis where you have, "You shall not suffer a librarian to live," is the whole premise of the book. And so we follow the story as this young individual begins by saving the life of a librarian and then going on the run. In terms of our premise, I admit I picked up this book or requested it for review because I thought that sounded amazing. The book itself was fine. I found it to be very juvenile. As I mentioned, it's kind of novella length and very short, and there just wasn't a lot of meat in it, and I just really wanted more from it. So it's, again, I appreciate it, but definitely I wish it was doing more complex things. It was kind of a fun read, but perhaps not the most memorable, and I kind of wanted the characters to be a little bit more complex with something like this. So not my favorite. If you want to check it out for yourself, I do understand that. Next up, we have Shigidi and the Brass Head of Obalufon. I do not know why I'm an online booktuber because I cannot pronounce things on camera, as you all well know, but this is a fantasy book that I received for review. I thought it was a very interesting setup and premise. It is a story that follows this god who is kind of the worst of the gods and gets the opportunity to become the lover to the succubus, and together they start a new life. I'm always just interested in stories that are told from different perspectives, bring in new diverse voices that I haven't heard before, and something that, again, is just right off the beaten path. And I will admit that this book is weird. It is a weird book that I picked up myself. I cannot blame Whitney for this one. However, I'll be honest, I didn't like this book as much as I thought I was going to. I did peek at some other reviews to see what other people were saying, and a lot of people don't like the sexual content in this book because it's definitely very adult. I happen to enjoy my fiction very adult, so that was not an issue there. Simply, I just didn't really connect with the story. I think part of it is that while this book is in a way fantasy, it's much more leaning into mythology in terms of the narrative style, and I don't love that as much. And it just didn't really capture me. It didn't really feel magical. And I feel like if you strip away the elements of God and succubus, this almost would have read more like contemporary. And it just wasn't as appealing as I would have liked it to be. So I do admit I had to try the story because I'm always looking for something different. But the problem with something different is sometimes you like it and, well, sometimes you don't. Next, we have God's War by Kameron Hurley. And this is a piece of sci-fantasy that definitely crosses the line between the two genres. This story follows a person named Nyx who them with their mercenary crew are doing a job. However, there's something that goes wrong with the government and this alien embassy, and they get caught in the middle of this. It's a story that is very messy in terms of how it's set up. The world building is very blurry, and it's something I've come to appreciate and recognize with Kameron Hurley is that they write worlds that are very expansive and unique and weird. However, they just choose to not simply spoon feed the reader. I mentioned that I really enjoy info dumps. However, maybe I'm contradicting myself, but I also really enjoy stories where we are dumped in the middle and have to figure it out for ourselves. And in a story like this, it is, as I mentioned, rather messy, and so I don't actually feel like we as the reader can fully understand the world we were placed into in the context of the story given the information we're given in this book. And I personally really enjoy it. I've read Kameron Hurley's work several times before and come to really like their style. It's not for everyone, I totally respect that, and I actually would not recommend starting with this book if you're interested in trying Kameron Hurley's work because I don't think it's their strongest piece. But like I said, I love the science fiction elements was probably something that really brought up the book for me. And then it still again has more magical elements to it that ties together. And I just love spending time with the characters who are always very morally gray and complex. And again, the world for me fascinates me. I love spending time in the story trying to understand the world, and that's basically what kept me preoccupied in this book. So I liked it. Not the place to start with Kameron Hurley, but one that you eventually want to read if you're a big fan of their work. And I also read Illborn by Daniel T. Jackson, and this is the first book in a new epic fantasy series where we follow 4 individuals that have magical powers. However, this is in a world where magical powers are forbidden. Years ago, I think it was 800 years, there was this divine lord who came in and forced this nation to bend to his will, and now they're dealing with the ramifications of that. And so we follow these 4 individuals who have, for the most part, tried to keep their powers hidden, and now are forced to come out and change and kind of give up their lives for something else. This book is one that captured my attention right from the prologue, which is absolutely gripping. It's dark, it's not what I expected, it's different, and I just read it and went, wow, I need to read this book right now. And I inhaled the rest of the book. I love the characters. As I mentioned, you have the different perspectives, and each one was equally interesting to me. This book felt very adult, very mature, and definitely a series I want to read further into because I think that there's a lot of potential there. So I was really pleased by this book. I've seen it kind of floating around online. I'm not really sure who recommended it to me, but I'm glad I gave it a try. It's so worth it. Highly recommend it, and definitely a new one with favorite potential. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know of the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And let me know down below in the comments, what is a weird book that you've recently read or one that you recommend to me? If you're new to my channel, I do read a lot of horror, thrillers, science fiction, fantasy, and other dark things, and apparently just weird books like this. So if you want to stick around, subscribe, I appreciate that. If you want to help me out with this video, I'd appreciate if you want to drop a thumbs up or a comment, even just like a little emoji, like a dragon or a spaceship. And if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss these videos from me. Thanks so much for watching. Talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.